Okay, welcome to the Denver Erlang and Elixir meetup. If you're joining on YouTube, this is for Monday, February 3rd. The meetup is sponsored by Praxis.io, which helps developers with security. The company started in Elixir and still by far has the best Elixir support on the market. So if you're using Elixir and Phoenix and your project is on the public internet, really, feel free to check it out. And there's a free tier, or you can jump right to an enterprise account. So for the main event, we have a really great speaker tonight, Jacob, who's very well known in the Elixir community from his YouTube. You've probably seen his YouTube videos or his podcast. He's giving a talk on the cost of Ecto Preload.
Awesome. I'm not going to go full screen here because I'm going to be jumping between a little demo project I made and some slides. And I can start with like a quick introduction. It's
Perfect.
hard to follow everyone up that just introduce themselves. We're in a group of some awesome people. I've been a software engineer for about 10 years now. I started as an iOS developer. Well, I should say Java, then iOS, and then Node.js, and did a bunch of like Node.js Express backend API work. And then in 2021, I discovered Elixir and loved Elixir so much, like many of you, but couldn't find work. So I ended up just basically starting my own consultancy. And I did that for about 4 years and started my YouTube channel, Elixir Mentor, and then a podcast. So if you haven't heard of that or checked that out, please check it out. And I think you'll enjoy some of my content, especially if you're new to Elixir. I have a lot of really good basic stuff. And then my podcast, a lot of fun. I just have awesome people from the community building awesome stuff. And with that being said, we can jump into our topic. I don't know if my title is that fair because it's kind of shifted, but I called it the cost of Ecto Preload. And I think it's more important to kind of be strategic about your database queries and being well aware of how you're actually fetching your data when you start building an application. Because from a lot of people's perspectives, we fetch data, we don't notice, you know, the cost of fetching a lot of data or being inefficient with fetching data, especially when you're building an MVP or might only have a few thousand users. But that changes when you have to start scaling and building your app to handle a larger and larger user base. And I recently just got hired on at a company called Collex as a senior engineer, and they're in a very like fast growth phase essentially. So you start running into new problems once you start having, a couple 100,000 active users a month, and the way you're querying your data matters, right? So let me see. I know how to do this, I think. All right. So there's a problem you run into when you start running like manual queries, right? It's the n+1 problem. So the more nested data you have, the more queries you have, and it builds and builds and builds, and it can become a huge problem. I'm going to just switch over. So I built a super small project, and it's basic. We have a basic user, and that user has a username and then a relationship to posts and comments. And then we have a post, and that will just be a title and content, and that belongs to a user, and then has many relationship to comments. And then we have our comments that belongs to a user and a post. So just with these three ecto schemas, we have some relationships going on and just enough data to kind of mess around and see what's actually happening behind the scenes when you do certain things. And then I should also mention that I wrote just like a little like wrapper function that, so instead of like having to go through our IEX shell and count our queries, I made like a little counter that is just going to count all of our queries for us so we can see what's actually happening when we do things. And one thing that I want to do, I seeded my database. I just wrote a seed script to create a bunch of users, posts, and comments. So I have data. And let me just pull that up. So I created 100 users. And we're going to see how all of this kind of compounds on itself, right? And then with those 100 users, shrink that. I have like 547 posts created. And then comments, I have about 5,600 comments that were all randomly generated on each post by different users. So we have a good amount of data that we can play around with. And let's see, we're going to start with the n plus one query problem. So this is what happens when, let's say, well, actually, let's open up our terminal and I'll make this a little larger. I'm going to just open up this project in an IX shell. And let's see if I can remember how to do this. Almost forgot how to do that. All right. So let's start an IX shell. And I have, let's see, a module here called no preload. And I'm just going to call the get all posts. So if we go ahead and do cost of Ecto, no preload, get all posts, I'm just querying our posts, right? So we're not getting any of our relationship or nested data. So the user that wrote it, the comments, and then the users that wrote the comment, we're not getting any of that. But as you can see, just doing the a manual post, um, we made one query, right? And we got 547 um, results back, but one query. So that's not bad. But now the problem that happens with manual posting is we want to now go through and load, every comment and every user. And, we want all the data for everything. But if we were to do that, I have to just peek. I can't remember what my functions are called. Get all posts with manual queries. So this is something you would never want to do. So get all posts with manual queries. And essentially what we're doing here is we're querying each thing in a for loop one at a time. So you can imagine we're going to have a lot of queries here to get our full results, right? So I'm going to hit enter here. It's going to take a second. And as you can see, we got our 547 posts back with all of our data preloaded. So we have all of our comments, or I should say, all of our posts with all the comments and all the users, but we basically queried everything in our database individually every single time. And that's insane, right? So you don't want to do that. And so Ecto Preload is an awesome solution. Comes with Ecto. It's amazing, right? And you can see this nice function here. All we have to do to get our preloaded data is mention the field that we want to preload. And in this case, we're going to preload user that belongs to a post. And then we also have our comments that belong to a post. And then we even have a nested user on comments. And, putting all this in a preload, we can now see what happens using preload. So if we pull open that code, it's the same thing. So basically calling preload like this or in pipe functions, it's going to function the same exact way. We're going to go from 6,000 some queries down to 4, and it doesn't matter how you call it. So if we go ahead and just say get posts, let's see, get posts, we're going to call our get posts nested from here. So we're going to do cost of ecto preload dot preload, and then get posts nested. Okay. And so when we do that, we get all of our data and we get much quicker. And essentially what's happening behind the scenes when you use Ecto Preload is we are querying all of our posts, correct? And then we're collecting all of the nested comments that go to each post, and we're getting all of that data. So all of the IDs we're collecting, and it's all happening in the background. And then we're querying all of the comments all at once. So all the comments all at once, and then we're collecting all the users that belong to the comments. So we're querying like each batch at a time. So we accumulate all of our posts, we get them, we accumulate all the comments to all the posts, and we get them, and then Ecto places them where they're supposed to be placed. And then as we go through, same thing. So nested users to comments, it's the same thing. So where do the four queries come from? So basically, we get first, we're getting the post, which is one. And then we're getting the user to each post, which is two. And then we're getting all the comments to all the posts, which is three. And then we're getting all the users again to each comment, which is four. So we just went from 6,700 queries to four queries just using preload. And preload is amazing, right? Like the efficiency alone in preload. And if you never really knew what preload did, now you do. And I'm guessing a lot of you guys have been in the Elixir space for quite some time, but it's important to know how many queries you're calling. And like, obviously this is an extreme example, but it's still good to know, like, are you over querying things? What is happening behind the scenes? Because it's easy to get sloppy with grabbing data and not actually thinking things through in an efficient manner. So I know this is dramatic, but it's kind of good to know. And it's one of those things, like as you build things, I always kind of keep track of how many queries are happening on like a REST API endpoint or like whatever I might be doing, right? And preload does have a little bit of a drawback. And when I say that, it's like when you think about like REST APIs, you're often returning the same payload no matter what the client needs, right? So you might have an endpoint and you're giving them the same response data for everything, for everything, for everything. So it's off like you're often just like over serving the client and they don't always need all that data. And you have a couple options, right? You could make a bunch of different endpoints. You could do a lot of extra work and, you know, keep a nice REST API, right? And just have different endpoints and return different amounts of data. But that's not always ideal, especially when you're in, a fast-paced startup, you're bootstrapping, you're just trying to acquire users and get new features out so, you can keep pulling in that user base, right? So that's where like GraphQL kind of comes in. And GraphQL is a querying language that kind of allows us to set up a like one endpoint, right? And what one endpoint to like get any of the data that you want. So it kind of eliminates the over serving piece that REST APIs deliver us. Now, don't get me wrong, like the difference between like if you can get all your data in a very effective way with preload, I would always go the simpler way. But with GraphQL, which is nice, is you can build out these query schemas, right? So like right here on the right, we have a query called posts. And everything we put in here, so you see ID, title, content, and then you see our user that has nested information as well, or nested fields, and then our comments. So you see our schema with all the nested data, right? What's nice with a GraphQL query is the client side can leave any of these things out. So like if we just deleted user here, we no longer have to query the nested user on posts. But if you did this on a REST API endpoint, that data would probably still be fetched on the server and returned to the client and just not used. So it's really important to know how you're consuming your data when you're starting to make these kind of like a data-driven decision, right? do we go down the REST API road, or do we consider using GraphQL in our projects? So something to keep in mind. Um, I don't want to get into this one yet. We'll come back to that. I'm going to walk through a little bit of this project where I create. Oh, and don't build your project like this. I kind of just threw things together. You would separate things, but in my schema file, I built my data loader and I built my schemas and I built my query types and all of that. You would separate these and organize your project like, a civilized human being. But for the sake of a demo, I threw it all in here so we could just talk about it easier in one spot. And we have some chatter going on. I should make sure. Nope, guess not. All right. So we have our schema, we have our data loader. I'll talk about the data loader in a second. But basically, what happens here when we set up our Absinthe schema is we kind of just copy our Ecto schemas. So we have our user and our fields. We have our comment, the same like everything that we're doing in our Ecto schemas. And then we have our post. And what you're going to notice here is when we have our nested users, we have a resolver. And this is where the data loader comes in. So a data loader is basically doing what preload does. We're basically, if that field is being requested, we're collecting all of those IDs for the query, and then we're fetching them all at once. So it's doing the same exact thing as a preloader, but the inside of the field, it has its own resolver. And the reason we have our own resolver is because if this field wasn't queried, we never have to request this data. And that's kind of what I was just talking about on that previous slide. So it's super beneficial. And I want to just do something really quick. It's going to throw an error because I have all of my functions wrapped in my little query counter. So it's not actually going to return the right data. But I want to show you what happens if we actually fetch. Um, so if we actually fetch our, like, let's say we're using GraphQL, but we're not going to use it properly. Because I got this question actually at my last meetup, and they're like, okay, what happens if I just use preload and our resolver can get a list of posts and we can preload everything, right? Which you could do. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close out of this because now we can use the graphical dashboard. So we'll do mix phx server. Okay, we're running on localhost. Let's open up a new private window and we'll go to localhost graphical. All right. And I believe I have a query saved. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I have a query saved right here, and hopefully everyone can see my screen. So we have a query, and queries are always in the outer curly braces, and then the actual query name, which is preload. And if we go back to our code and go into our schema, you can see that the field preload is right here. And so it's going to call our post. Okay. And then inside of this is going to return a bunch of posts with the ID, title, content, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. So I'm going to go ahead and just execute this query. And we're going to get an error, but we care more about the query count. Okay. So it's going to blow up, but this is what I want you guys to notice right here. This number of queries is 4. And remember what I was saying, like, what if all of a sudden, like, we didn't care about the user that wrote the post and I removed that. And then I queried this again. We're still getting 4 queries. Okay, so this is where the benefit of using a data loader comes in, is we're not always preloading user. So if I go ahead and just call our posts query now, so instead of preload, I have my posts query with an S. If I go ahead and just hit this, we get our posts back, no errors anymore. So we're actually going to have to go and count our queries here. But you're going to see that the query came in and we got our 1 query, 2, and then 3. Okay, so we removed user, right? And so we only queried for 3 things. But if we put our user back in, and I think we have a username. So if I go ahead and query this again, we get all of our data back. And now if we count our queries, we'll go up to okay, so we have our 1 query for posts, and then for users, which is 2, and then comments, which is 3, and then users again for the users that wrote the comments, which is 4. So our queries increased, right? And then like if we didn't care about users in any case on the post or comments, and we queried this again, now we drop down to just 2 queries. So it might not seem like a huge savings, but in the grand scheme of things, once you start having hundreds of thousands of queries for the same kind of data, this kind of stuff can make a huge drastic improvement to app performance and just everything overall. So I think it's really cool to think about this kind of stuff and pay attention to how many queries you're actually hitting when you're, retrieving data from your database. So obviously, like data loading benefits, you can reduce query count depending on what your client is actually asking for, right? And so you can increase just scalability and just efficiency. And then the more complex your data query or your database queries get, you're just a little more flexible. I will say there are probably some downsides with the flexibility of GraphQL. If you have a lot of developers with vast differences in skill and a lot of like front end guys that might not think things through at a performant level, they can over query and ask for things without you realizing that they're over querying data and not using it all. But for the most part, on small teams and a place where, you're doing PRs and you're discussing things on a regular basis, it's a pretty clean way and efficient way to handle data. And it makes the backend engineer's life a lot easier because you're not having to make a ton of different endpoints to serve all different kinds of data and queries and mutations to your client side apps. So it just makes your backend a lot more flexible for, your web-based apps, iOS apps, whatever you might be doing. So we already talked about this. We went through the resolvers, and that a resolver is, or I should say a data loader is exactly the same thing as using Ecto Preload. It's just kind of GraphQL's way of doing it. And there are differences behind the hood, but as far as for this talk goes, they work essentially the same way. So the key takeaways are like Ecto Preload, I think, is essential. If you don't use it, you should, because a lot of people in your context files, you'll individually query things and maybe not make relationships the way you should. And Ecto Preload really cuts down on your queries. So if you have relationships and nested data, you want to be doing this. And I know a lot of people will try to avoid having relationships in your database, thinking they simplify things. But if you actually have the proper relationships set up, you can make your queries a lot more efficient in the long run. And then like GraphQL is based client-driven queries, which has its positives and its negatives. You can go both ways, but I think overall it's a positive, and it relieves a lot of workload on your backend engineers. And yeah, so data loading with GraphQL. You just utilize, batching of data in a much more efficient way, and you're not manually querying everything that you need. You can get it in batches. So that's what I have. And I don't really know what the format of this meetup is, but like I'd love just to kind of open the floor up and hopefully we can have just dialogue and conversation between everyone.